Our last speaker this afternoon, I'm delighted to introduce Hugh O'Connell. Hugh, as you know, is the political correspondent with the Sunday Business Post. He is former political editor of the Journal.ie, and Hugh has worked for BBC Radio 4 and indeed for News Talk, a regular contributor on radio and television, and an occasional lecturer in journalism. I invite Hugh to come and share his comments with us now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gráinne, and to the three previous speakers as well, which all with very interesting observations. I suppose I'm going to talk a little bit about the media and some of reflections on the media and the way in which they covered the referendum, and obviously draw as well in a bit of politics, given my role as a political correspondent. So, as Gráinne alluded to, I was previously the political editor of the Journal.ie, and I was the political editor of the Journal.ie when the referendum was happening last year. I suppose the one thing I'd say up front, and I think it was kind of the elephant in the room for a lot of media organisations and a lot of journalists covering this referendum, is that I don't think it's a revelation to say that the vast majority of journalists in the country were probably in favour of a yes vote and probably in favour of marriage equality. And so that, I think, created issues in terms of, whether or not they would disclose their views. Some journalists did and were quite open about it. Some obviously privately would have been quite passionate about the issue. And some would probably have been like me. I voted yes. I didn't have a particularly passionate stance on the issue. I just felt that this wasn't really an issue, in that gay people, some of whom are my friends, some of whom are my family members, should be allowed to get married, and that should be it. And why are we even having this debate? I wasn't going to be out on the streets campaigning on the issue if I wasn't a journalist. But I just, that's the kind of attitude that I took. So I think the no side were acutely aware of this, the fact that they felt the media were against them, because the media, by and large, were in favour of a yes vote and thought that marriage equality, same-sex marriage, was a good idea. And so you had Ronan Mullen, the Conservative independent senator, calling it kind of groupthink in the media. I spoke to him recently when I was working on an article reflecting on the marriage referendum 1 year on, and he talked about how the fact that the media would not have kind of taken the sort of celebratory approach that they took to the yes vote on count day had it been a no vote. He said the media had lost the run of itself. And I think, they are points to consider. I'm not averse to criticism of my profession. I think personally the media got it wrong in terms of its assessment of the referendum, and particularly this was prevalent within political journalism during the referendum. This idea that there was a big silent no vote out there, that the referendum was going to eke through, or not even, it was going to fall, because there were these silent no voters all over the country who were too afraid to tell pollsters that they wanted to vote no, and so they would say vote yes, and then actually when they went into the privacy of the polling booth, they marked the ballot card or the ballot paper no. But I think we kind of got that wrong, because if you look at the result, it was an overwhelming result for yes, and I think that the media needs to reflect on that, and this whole idea of whether there was a bit of a groupthink towards this idea of a yes vote. Particularly when there's further referenda, I think it's referendums, on social issues kind of coming down the track. And of course the media had to be aware, and particularly the broadcast media had to be aware of the need to provide balanced reporting of both sides. For the broadcast media, that's obviously in line with the Coughlin judgment, which requires 50-50 coverage for yes and no in a referendum. It's often confused with the McKenna judgment, but it's actually the Coughlin judgment, according to Noel Whelan, who made that point to me recently when I was talking to him, so I thought I'd better clarify that. It was particularly difficult to represent the 50% no side, because there were so few groups on the no side, so few politicians particularly, which was of interest to me, given my profession, a very small number of politicians. Then you had groups like Mothers and Fathers Matter, the Iona Institute, and the Catholic Church as well, and the bishops who would have been out in force. And then you had, by contrast, all of the political parties in favour of a yes vote, and a concerted effort by all of the political parties, well, not all of them, we'll talk about Fianna Fáil in a second, but we had Fine Gael and Labour, the government effectively, and Labour having pushed Fine Gael into this position of holding a referendum and really put pressure on them to hold a referendum. But Fine Gael, to its credit, led a very concerted effort to get the referendum passed, and you had people front and centre of that. Jerry Buttimer, one of the few openly gay politicians in the country, obviously Leo Varadkar. But also, I think, it's worth mentioning the Taoiseach Enda Kenny, who took a bit of a journey on this issue. 4 years ago now at this stage, he famously tripped over a flower pot as he was backing away from journalists who were pursuing him on this issue about whether there would be a marriage referendum in the lifetime of this government. And he was always kind of uncomfortable with the issue for quite a long time. I remember I was at a briefing with him before Christmas in 2013, and Eamon Gilmore that year had said that that same-sex marriage was the civil rights issue of this generation. And Eamon Gilmore had outlined this view, and I asked the Taoiseach whether he took a similar view, whether he thought that same-sex marriage was the civil rights issue of this generation. And he kind of shuffled uncomfortably, paused, didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then delivered a really passionate response, which centred not on marriage equality, but about job creation and employment. So, but he eventually got there. I think he got it eventually. I think the personal stories, particularly people like Jerry Buttimer coming to him and saying that he was gay, people like Leo Varadkar saying it to him, and then people in his constituency and people would have written to him about this issue, and eventually he came round to this idea. And I remember at the press conference to launch Fine Gael's campaign during the referendum, he spoke very, very passionately about this, I thought, as someone from the west of Ireland, an older man, as Jane touched on earlier, who by and large either voted no or stayed at home. But he was prepared to front up when it came to this. And I think he deserves a bit of credit because he's getting an awful lot of flack at the moment, the Taoiseach. So I think that's worth mentioning. And then Fianna Fáil, its approach to the referendum was, I think, divided. Senior echelons of the party, senior leadership in the party were prepared to front up, get out there, debate the issues, canvass. Micheál Martin led the charge on that. He's an excellent debater, so I think that helped as well. In fact, Fianna Fáil were pretty annoyed, or particularly Micheál Martin was particularly annoyed, that he wasn't getting on the radio and in the media a bit more to talk about the referendum, because he wanted to make the case for a yes vote. But then there were a lot of TDs, some TDs and an awful lot of senators in Fianna Fáil who privately were very uncomfortable with this whole thing and believed that it would have lost them votes in their constituencies. Whether this was misguided or not, I think it probably was, given the actual passage of the vote and the strength of the yes vote. But they weren't prepared to get out there, whereas there was kind of a small group within Fianna Fáil, particularly at a kind of a local level, and particularly within Ogre Fianna Fáil, the youth wing of the political party, who kind of pounded the pavements, knocked on the doors and made the effort to get a yes vote. And we had people like Avril Power, former Senator Avril Power, who really did, I mean, she literally ran between doorstep and doorstep in order to get knock on as many doors as possible and get the message across as much as she could. But she felt as if the party at the senior level wasn't supporting her and wasn't supporting this and wasn't making sure that everyone was out there campaigning for Fianna Fáil for a yes vote. And she quit the party 2 days after the referendum result itself. I think overall political parties didn't receive much in the way of a boost in the polls because they campaigned for marriage equality. They failed to capitalise on the significant mobilisation and engagement from young people in the referendum. When it came to the most recent election, I think that's fair enough. I remember a lot of politicians talking about needing to capitalise on the fact that we had 60,000 extra people on the register, that we had a lot of young people get out there in the marriage referendum campaign, and that there was a need to try and translate that into making sure that they get out during the general election and that they vote in the general election. And I don't think that necessarily happened. So that's a problem and an issue that is facing political parties, and they continue to struggle to attract young voters. And even just to make politics relevant to young people is very difficult. There are very few people of my age, I'm 28 years of age, who are engaged in politics to the extent that I am, which is probably a good thing because I'm a bit troubled by by how nerdy I am about it all. But there are very few who kind of feel politics is in any way relevant to their lives. So that's a challenge. One other thing I'll point out is Matty McGrath, the Tipperary independent TD, was one of the few politicians who advocated a no vote, and he was re-elected in Tipperary. And I think one of the reasons he was re-elected is because he did advocate for a no vote, and that allowed him to get out in the media much more. And I know that he would have locally capitalised on the fact that he advocated for a no vote amongst some of his supporters. So that is one politician who benefited from advocating for a no vote. or advocating one way or the other on a referendum. Just in terms of media coverage, I think you could say the news outlets were kind of given early notice of the difficulties they were going to face with this referendum, with the Pantygate controversy in January 2014. We're all familiar with, I think probably here, with the Pantygate controversy, Rory O'Neill going on the Saturday Night Show talking about some commentators in the media who he alleged were homophobic. RT threatened with legal action by these commentators, RT removing the interview from its website, paying an undisclosed sum to these to some of these commentators, and issuing an apology. And it generated huge debate about free speech in the media in this country. But RT arguably saved itself an awful lot of money and the state by extension, and taxpayers by extension, by avoiding the costly defamation suits. And we can argue the rights and wrongs of whether they should have paid out, but they did. And I think that made RT inherently cautious when it came to its approach on the referendum. I'm not here to kick the national broadcaster, but I might just be kicking it a little bit now when I look at what I'm about to say. But it was kind of spooked by the controversy to the extent that it was almost constantly approaching the issue with that in its mind. The Coughlin judgment was very much on its mind. This benefited the No side, as it ran most of its campaign through the media. The No side did not have a ground campaign in the same way that Yes Equality did and the political parties did. The No side focused on the idea that two biological parents of the opposite sex are the ideal form of family, and that same-sex marriage endangers all of this, and therefore other families are less deserving. I think that's bullshit, but they didn't. The No side brought in extraneous issues like surrogacy, adoption, and the welfare of children that were not relevant to the core questions of the campaign, and they were constantly bringing them up in the media. They were constantly part of the debate, when I don't think they should have been, because the debate really should have been about, should couples of the same sex be entitled to marry each other? That's all it was about. These arguments were repeated ad nauseum in the media and debates. They frustrated the Yes side in that RTE, unlike in previous referendums about European treaties and issues like this, they didn't bring forward their specialist correspondents. So in a European referendum, usually they bring in their economics editor or their business editor to kind of interrogate the arguments that were being made during their campaigns. But you didn't have the health or social affairs correspondents in RTE being brought in to sort of fact check some of the arguments that both sides were making. That just wasn't there. Occasionally, there were some timely interventions by Geoffrey Shannon, the chair of the Adoption Authority, in particular, I think, on the Clareburn Live show, and debunked a lot of the arguments in and around adoption, and deconstructed some of the myths. But unfortunately, RT's cautious approach meant that this was actually counted, even though he was an objective, unbiased observer in all of this. That counted as time for the Yes side. From a practical point of view, it's just worth noting, and from a media point of view, the No side were very reluctant to have people out canvassing with them. A few colleagues who I would have spoken to when I was writing this up kind of said that we just couldn't get out with the No side on the doorsteps. They didn't want journalists going along with them. So I think that's interesting. The debates, there was no real controversy over the debates, I don't think. There was no gotcha, Tweetgate kind of controversy. The best debate, I think, was Micheál Martin against Bruce Arnold on Morning Ireland in the last few days of the campaign. Micheál just, being one of the best debaters in the country, I think, certainly one of the best debaters in politics in this country, emerged a very clear victor and really deconstructed some of the bogus arguments that Bruce Arnold was making. Also, just finally, I want to acknowledge the contribution of my colleague, Ursula Halligan, TV3's political editor. She wrote a really powerful op-ed in the Irish Times on the 16th of May last year, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I think it was one of the seminal moments of the campaign. She spoke of being in sort of a prison in her own mind since the age of 17, living half a life, repressing her instinct to love, and of the precious time she lost living in fear and isolation. It was a really searingly honest piece, I think, that spoke to so many people in so many different ways, from those who could identify with the same feelings and emotions that Halligan had been going through, to those who were just deeply touched by her willingness to speak about this issue so honestly. It touched the hearts and changed minds across the country. I've no doubt about that. Ursula is just fantastic. The fact that she removed herself from TV3's referendum coverage, I think, was a testament to her utmost professionalism. I'm lucky enough in Leinster House to occasionally cross paths with Ursula, and she's just one of the most nicest people in there. And she's just, perhaps more importantly, she's a really good journalist, really, really good journalist, and I think very underappreciated in this country. And just a wider point about the legacy of the referendum, and this isn't just related to the media or politics or anything like this. What does it mean for future referendums? And I know Jane would have touched on the referendum to repeal the 8th. Some have kind of sought to draw the links, and there are some links, but you know, in some ways there are not. Marriage is, or at least should be, a very wonderful, joyous occasion. People want to get married. I don't think anyone, if they had a choice, would want to go through with an abortion. I think there should be abortion available in this country, but I don't think anyone would choose to go through that if they didn't have to. So to repeal the 8th Amendment, I think will require winning the hearts and minds of the people who understandably struggle with the issue. But you know, it's going to be a very different campaign. It's going to be a lot more divisive. It's going to be very difficult to win. It's going to be very difficult to convince people, and it's not going to be as joyous as that day in Dublin Castle. So I think that's just something bearing in mind as we approach that referendum, which will probably be next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.